Okay, there's two things I'd like to talk about. I'd like to talk about authenticity, which you've mentioned and is a buzzword that you see across tourism.
Yep.
Little understood, I think. Little understood in terms of its relationship with responsibility either. So I'd like to talk about that. And then I'd like to talk about the other word, which seems to be becoming the next big theme, or one of the next big themes, which is overtourism.
Sure.
But firstly, in terms of authenticity, what does that really mean in tourism?
Let me answer that with a couple of examples. Years ago, I was in Delhi with a tour group. I was a tour leader, and there was my tour group and a Russian tour group in a theatre watching an Indian classical dance. I spent most of my time talking to the Russian tour leader because it happened to be somebody I'd worked with in Moscow previously. But I did that because it didn't feel authentic, and it didn't feel authentic because the audience was Russian and British. 10 years later, in Kerala, with the director of tourism, he takes me to see a local group doing Indian classical dance. I'm the only non-Indian in the audience. I suddenly realised it's the same classical dance that I'd seen before. It felt authentic because I was there with local people. It was clearly a part of their culture. It wasn't just being put on for me as a tourist. They were enjoying it. The director was explaining it to me and enjoying it himself. Now, I have the privilege to have that kind of experience now quite often because of the way I travel. Most tourists are craving that kind of much more intimate engagement with the experience of living in that culture. And that's where the authenticity comes from. It's that sense of a shared experience with someone from another culture. You remember we gave the Responsible Tourism Award to the Sock Mob organisation for organising Unseen London. And you talk to people who've done those.
Just tell us a little bit about, just remind us the story there before talking about Sock Mob. What was the idea behind Sock Mob?
Sock Mob itself was set up to give socks to homeless people living on the streets, because that's a big issue if you're living on the streets, is having some warm socks. They realised, to their absolute credit I think, that there was a potential way out of homelessness for some of those homeless people if they became tour guides showing people the London that they saw as homeless people. And they obviously see a very different side to London. They know the area where they live on the streets much more intimately than most of us know, probably even their own street. And they set up unseen tours. And I talk to people who've done those experiences. And what comes back is this sense of having seen something quite exotic of their own country, which is on their doorstep, but they've not seen it. And I think many of us don't realise that actually on our doorstep are these interestingly very different experiences where you're actually getting into the back streets is as interesting as it would be in Morocco or in Banjul in the Gambia.
It always seems to make sense to me that the type of authentic experience that you describe is more likely to be offered to you by somebody who feels fairly treated by you and by the tourism industry. So that seems to me to be an argument for a strong link. If you treat people right, they're more likely to open their doors, their ways of life, their traditions and rituals to you. So I see quite a strong link between authenticity and responsibility. Do you see it in that same way?
I think that I see the link as even stronger than that, Justin. And the reason is, if you look at what's happened in Kerala, for example, where they've had a big state government funded effort to try and improve the experience that tourists have of visiting villages, but also, more important, improving the experience the villagers have of being visited. So they now have all kinds of responsible tourism products where you go with a guide who can do the translation, but with a local guide from the village into a village, and you have a series of encounters which involve, for example, trying out how to make rope from the husk and the coir on coconuts. You actually have the experience of engaging with that, or buying a boat from the craft worker who's made it in his own home, seeing how the vegetables are grown, maybe having a meal in that. Now, that's clearly an authentic experience. There can be no question. These are not places that permanently do tourism. These are opportunities which are providing an additional income for a relatively poor farmer to make money from tourism to supplement their household income. But the point about that is there is nowhere to hide for the tour operator in that. You know, the person who you are visiting has to want to engage, has to feel that it's a fair exchange, has to feel that there's respect on both sides, or else it won't work. And for the overseas operator, perhaps, who's sending tourists into that environment, the key thing is that the tourist is not going to be embarrassed. And they're not going to feel that they have to give money and tips all the time, because they know that that family has been properly recompensed for the time that they're giving, the time and the access to their environment. So it actually works on both sides. And I think that is, for me, one of the most interesting developments in recent years, is the number of places where people are working to make that encounter much better for the tourist, but more importantly, or as importantly, more important for the community.
I think the example you gave of taking that out of the picture, so the tourist and the local person know right from get-go that it's all taken care of, means that whatever relationship you develop is a genuine one. And I think that's very important in tourism.
And it also means you know that it's based on a degree of fairness and a degree of respect, and that you can ask questions without feeling that you need to buy something in order to justify being there. That, I think, is really fundamental, and that's where the authenticity and the responsible tourism thing go together.
If we're honest about the tourism industry, authenticity is not a word that you'd find closely associated with much of it. I think the tourism industry has become obsessed, parts of the tourism industry obsessed with the notion of paradise. That what they are selling the tourist is an escape from all of reality to something which is better, perfect, more magical. In fact, it's paradise. And that becomes one of the big selling points for the industry. That means that you end up having to sort of fake up the experience in pretense of paradise. That the truth is the victim, because you cannot then say, listen, these animals are endangered or these local people are poor, because that doesn't relate well to notions of paradise. And I think this idea of paradise has become a real roadblock. It's become a real roadblock to authenticity, and it's also become a real roadblock to dealing with some of the issues in tourism destinations, because if you can't speak about them because they don't fit with notions of paradise, you certainly can't do anything about it.
And the other element of it is what the operators are selling. Now, you can go to some of the safari parks, as you and I both have in Africa, and you can see conserved wildlife. Think about Kruger. There's not much natural about Kruger, really. It's a highly managed environment, and it's a constructed experience. I mean, I've been told that the guy who's responsible for fire, managing the estate with fire, part of what he was doing was making sure that tourists could get photographs of the animals by reducing the height of the fire. I'm sure that's true. I mean, these are all managed environments. There are very few unmanaged environments left in the world. Now, whether they're paradise or rubbish tips, they're all a consequence of human activity. And I think part of the problem is that we still have a notion that there is unspoilt land. And I've recently been looking at Antarctica, and it's quite clear that human influence in Antarctica is way higher than we'd like to admit. I think that's a broader cultural problem, but it impacts on the way we understand tourism in a very unhelpful way. And people do think they're buying a little bit of paradise if they go off to one of the high-end resorts and buy their place on the beach. They don't want to be reminded. But we need to remember, I think, that whilst it's a significant part of tourism, it's a relatively small part. That's not what people are doing when they go to Barcelona for the weekend.